Okay, now it's recording.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. The title of my talk is "I don't see as many butterflies as I used to." Is this statement really true? Next slide, please. I did it. All right. So this is a red admiral. This is one of the first butterflies that I remember seeing as a little boy. I got my first butterfly net from the Easter Bunny when I was 6. And when I was very young and out collecting butterflies, I would frequently hear people saying, "Oh, you don't see as many butterflies as you did when I was a child." This is back in the early 60s. And I have heard this statement my entire life. Now I'm old enough to be one of those people. And human memory being what it is, it's not terribly reliable about things like this necessarily. If you're not actually paying attention to butterflies deliberately, you might look back and remember that day that you were in a field and there were butterflies everywhere and kind of remember that as typical, which it wasn't necessarily the case. You probably won't remember all the days that you were out and there weren't many butterflies around unless you were specifically looking for them. Now, I do remember as a child, many times my father would take us out butterfly collecting, and there were many times that we would get stung, we wouldn't see anything. So you can sort of just, regarding the vagaries of human memory, make the argument either way. There really are fewer butterflies, or, oh, that's just how human memory works. An additional question, next slide, has to do with the kinds of butterflies that we're looking at. So on the right here is a beautiful tiger swallowtail. And this is a very common butterfly. These remain abundant here in northern Illinois today. Are species like that doing okay? What about the species on the left, a regal fritillary? That's a prairie species. Maybe species that really require specialized habitats are doing badly, but everything else is doing okay. What's the answer here? And I think it's wonderful that here in Illinois, we can take a more scientific approach to answering this question. Next slide, please. So you perhaps have heard of something called the windshield effect. And it's sort of a bunch of less formal observations that say that just insects in general aren't doing very well. You're not seeing as many bug bodies plastered all over your windshield when you drive as you were 15 or 20 years ago. And again, people are trying to take a little bit more rigorous approach to see if this is really the case, or it's just got something to do with our perception, or maybe current car design, or something like that. But does it actually have to do with the abundance of butterflies? Next slide, please. Excuse me, the abundance of insects. Well, a couple of years ago, there was even a major article in the New York Times suggesting the insect apocalypse is here, that insects are crashing. And the thing about this article is this was, in fact, based on the publication of a number of studies that seem to suggest that insects are, in fact, declining. Next slide, please. So here is, I'm going to step out because I don't have anything to guide me here. So here is a list of studies that have been published 2018 and earlier, suggesting declines in insects. We have a study from Puerto Rico that looked at arthropods in general, so insects plus things like spiders and millipedes. A study from Germany that measured insects on the basis of their weight in terms of how much gets collected in certain types of insect traps. Two studies from Great Britain, one that was measuring the numbers of ground beetles that are encountered, a North American study about bumblebees, and the second study from Great Britain about moths. And all of these, the key take home here is that all of these are in very different parts of the world. They have used very different sampling techniques, and they are looking at very different taxa, and yet all of them have shown significant declines in insects. Next slide, please. So this is where Illinois comes in, and this is where the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network comes in. This is a program that was founded in 1987. I was, in fact, one of the founding members of the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, but the person who actually developed the network and started it was Ron Panzer from Northeastern Illinois University. This program was initially started by the Nature Conservancy, and it was part of a series of programs that were started to try to monitor responses of various taxa, biotic taxa, to land management. At that time, the Nature Museum, Nature Conservancy was sponsoring a large number of ecological restoration activities, including the activity that Barbara was mentioning earlier, which is where we initially met. And so a lot of these activities are primarily aimed at the plants. We do things like clearing brush and removing invasive species. We gather and scatter seed. We introduce landscape scale forces like fire back onto the land. And what effects are these things having on the animals? And butterflies were chosen as a particularly good study group for a number of reasons. First of all, they're easy to study. They're big, they're diurnal. There are a lot of field guides available. This was even relatively true in 1987. It's much more true today. There's been just an explosion of field guides to butterflies. You don't need specialized equipment to study them, and there is a reasonably small number of species that are reasonably easy to learn to identify, all of which makes butterflies excellent as a study group. The program is currently supported by the Chicago Academy of Sciences, making note of our Nature Museum, and it is one of 3 programs sponsored by the museum, the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Illinois Odonate Survey, and the Calling Frog Survey. These are all volunteer-based, and I like to say that we were doing, at the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, we're doing citizen science before it even had a name. If you do a phrase search in Google Books for the phrase citizen science, it's flat at almost nothing until 1992, and then it kind of takes off like a rocket. And so we were already functional for 5 years when citizen science began gaining currency as a term to describe this sort of activity. Next slide, please. So how does the program work? Leon, you may recognize the person in this picture. It's you. Our protocol is something called a Pollard transect. This protocol was developed in England in the late 1970s by a man named Ernie Pollard, and that's how it got its name. And he specifically wanted to survey butterflies. And he wanted the survey technique that he was developing to fit several criteria. He wanted it to be quantitative. He wanted it to be something that could be done easily and reproducibly and reproduced in a wide variety of places, and something where the data could be collected by people who don't necessarily have formal scientific training. And so he came up with this method, and it's now become something, excuse me, of a gold standard. And it is used all over the world, mostly for butterflies, but there are other taxa too, like dragonflies and damselflies, where pollard surveys are used to assess population numbers. So what it involves is every person who does this is assigned a particular place, and there is a walking survey route set up on that place. And the person walks their survey route at a constant pace, and while they're walking, they envision themselves inside of a bubble, 20 feet on each side of themselves, 20 feet in front of themselves, 20 feet over themselves. And the bubble moves with them as they walk. And while they're walking, they count all of the butterflies or dragonflies, if you're a dragonfly monitor, inside of the bubble. And importantly, the survey is conducted at least 6 times each year. One of the things that some of the annual surveys that are done once a year at the same time every year have started running into a little trouble with in some cases is that change in climate has changed the phenology of organisms, and things that might be right at their peak of activity when that survey was happening 20 years ago, you're now well past the peak. So having multiple visits ameliorates that particular type of problem. Next slide, please. So this map here shows where the survey sites in the Chicago metropolitan area here. And I'll mention the metropolitan area a number of times here. We're referring to Cook County and the Collier counties. And as you can see, the survey sites are scattered. They're widely distributed. We actually have surveys taking place all across Illinois and Northwest Indiana. So our surveys go right from the Wisconsin border. You can see some of them on this map. From Lake Michigan all the way over to the Mississippi River and down. We've actually got a surprising number of surveys going on near Carbondale. And they are not affiliated with the university. They are mostly associated with Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge. Most of the survey sites are concentrated here in the Chicago metropolitan area. Not terribly surprising. It's where the main population base from which volunteers to collect data can be drawn. Next slide, please. So the program has been very successful. This graph shows over time the number of surveys that are conducted every year and submitted to the database. So it starts from a modest number of surveys back in 1987, and since 2019, we have been over 1,000 surveys submitted annually every year. 2020, we had a little fallback that's mostly due to COVID. There were a bunch of sites that people did not have access to for a significant part of the monitoring season. So that caused a little bit of fall off. Surveys, we generally don't get all of the surveys in until sometime in November. We will almost certainly go over 1,000 surveys this year. We've got something like 987 surveys that have already been submitted. So this is a very large data set. Next slide, please. Here's some numbers. Okay, here we go. So the last year for which we have all of the data, most of the data are reflected here, is last year. And in 2022, 1,101 surveys were received. Eventually, it was actually somewhat more than this, but that's approximately. People were out in 2022 for 2,704 hours. We saw 34,555 butterflies last year, which comes down to 12.78 butterflies per hour of survey time. Over the entire lifetime of the monitoring network, we now have over 20,000 surveys in our database. This makes the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network one of the largest continuous quantitative data sets regarding butterfly populations in North America. And the volunteer monitors deserve a great deal of credit for this. We have now over 2.6 person years in the field time, and have counted over 18,000, counted over 817,000 butterflies. Notice the larger number. If you look over the entire lifespan of the monitoring network, there have been considerably more butterflies per hour recorded than there were in 2022. 35.22 over the entire lifetime of the program, 12.78 in 2022. That is, those two figures in comparison in isolation don't necessarily mean very much, but they do suggest a hypothesis that can be tested that butterfly abundance perhaps has declined over time. So let's take a look at that. Next slide, please. So for this analysis, what we're doing is we're creating an annual butterfly index. So the data that I'm going to be showing is going to be limited to data that were collected in the 6-county region of the Chicago metropolitan area. So for each year, we total up all of the butterflies that were counted that year within this area, and we total up all of the time that people have been out in the field collecting this data set. And we divide the number of butterflies by the total time, and that creates the annual index of butterfly abundance. And the units are so many butterflies per hour of field time. Then, for the period of time that we are looking at, we simply can average those numbers. So in the slide that I'm going to show in a minute, we will look at everything from 1987 to 2018, average the butterfly index for each of those years, and use that as kind of a baseline to look at deviation each year. And what we will be looking at is each year's index above or below the average. Now, one of the things that's important to remember here is that we're not identifying the butterflies in this analysis. We're just throwing everything into the same pot, adding them all up, and looking at total numbers of butterflies. Next slide, please. So here are the results that you get when you do this analysis for Bluff Spring Fen. The 0 in the middle represents 0 deviation from the average of the index for each of those years. So bars that are above the line, we saw more than the average numbers of butterflies. Bars that are below the line, we saw less than the average number of butterflies for Bluff Spring Fen. And what you can see here is there is a definite trend that prior to 2009, it's above, it's below, it's above, it's below. That's sort of what you would expect. That's how biological data work. But since about 2009, it's been consistently below the average for this long-term data set. Next slide, please. Let's look at a little larger scale here. This is Kane County. Now, Kane County had some bad years in the beginning, but once again, consistently, since, in this case, 2013, there have been just a string of years where it's below average, below average, below average. Next slide, please. If you look at the whole metro area, you see something similar. There were a couple of bad years in a row early on in the program, but the most recent years have been consistently showing a below average trend. Now, these analyses here, this is not really publishable. This is not a recognized quantitative technique, but it's a very good visual technique for making it easy to see what's going on. If you want to do some sort of more rigorous approach to the data that might be publishable at some point, you might want to do something like regression analysis. So we'll say on the next slide a little bit about that. So linear regression takes a series of points in the Cartesian plane with an x and a y axis and fits a line to them. And it generally uses some sort of variant on something called the least squared method, which basically fits the best line. It is the line that best describes the distribution of all of the points in aggregate. And this is very good for looking at trends, because if the x-axis is a time series, then you're looking at trends over time. So the slope of the line is what's important. If the line has a positive slope, you're seeing a trend of increase over time. If the line has a negative slope, you're seeing a trend of decrease over time. And if there is no change over time, the line will have a zero slope. So our null hypothesis for this particular analysis is going to be that the slope does not differ significantly from zero. Now, the factors that come out when you do this type of analysis, you get basically you get an equation back, and the equation has a slope, a significance, and a correlation coefficient. We've already talked about the slope. The significance is the chance with which those numbers are related just by random chance, the odds with which those numbers are related just by random chance, as opposed to having a specific correlation with each other. And so the smaller the p-value is, the greater the probability that the numbers are not simply randomly related. In general, statisticians like to use a value of 0.05 as a cutoff point for statistical significance, and 1 minus 0.05, 0.95, there is a 95% chance at that point that the data are not correlated just by random chance. So a really small p-value is good. The correlation coefficient, one of the things that it tells you is the percentage of variance in the data that is explained by your model. So again, what percentage of the spread of your data is explained by the line that you have fitted to it. So this value is going to range between 0 and 1. If it's 1, it means it's perfectly, completely correlated. And if that were the case, all of the points would line up directly on the line that you had calculated. If there is a correlation coefficient of 0.5, it means that 50%, half of the variance, is a result is explained by the model of the line that you have fit to it. So on the next slide, this is what happens when you take those annual indices of butterfly abundance. And this is done for the metropolitan area of Chicago data here. And plot them against time. And this particular part of the data shows the annual indices of butterfly abundance from 2000 to 2018. And what you can see is the line does have a negative slope. The slope is minus 1.07 butterflies per hour per year. So that is the rate of decline of rate of observation of butterflies during pollen surveys over this time frame. The grade in area is the 95% confidence intervals for this line, so most of the points fall within that. That's a good thing. The p-value, this has a very, very low p-value. I always need to look again. It's 0.0002. That is an extremely high significance, and so we can be very confident that this trend over time is not just a result of random variation in the data. The R-squared value is 0.6. That means 60% of the variance of the data is explained by this linear relationship. For an environmental study, that's very good. back in my days of being a biochemist, you'd want a much higher R-squared value than that for your experiments. But you're in a lab where you're getting to control a whole lot of variables that you don't get to control, say, out of Puff Spring Fen when you're counting butterflies. So this is, I would characterize this as an alarming trend. This says that in common with those other studies that we were looking at earlier, we are losing butterflies over time. And on that depressing note, let's go to the next slide. And I forgot that I was going to go here, but yes, I am going to go here. So why is this happening? Is this uniform throughout the butterflies? Well, we can't know unless we analyze all of the species individually, and that becomes very cumbersome to do. But is it possible that one or maybe a few species are actually what are declining? Butterflies as a whole, other than those species, are doing okay. And there's really only one species in the Chicago metropolitan area that is abundant enough to possibly have its thumb on the scale and be influencing this, and that's the cabbage white. The cabbage white, 35% of all butterflies recorded in the Butterfly Monitoring Network's database are cabbage whites. That's an enormous percentage, and unfortunate that that many butterflies are a non-native invasive species. Nonetheless, the cabbage whites were crashing hugely. That could influence the data as a whole and make it seem that butterflies as a whole were doing badly, when in fact it's just the cabbage white. So, first of all, is that actually happening? Well, let's take a look at that on the next slide. Well, cabbage whites are declining over time. The decline is negative 0.03 butterflies per hour, so that's not quite as much as the decline as butterflies as a whole. It's still statistically significant with a p-value of 0.016, R-squared 0.26. Probably not surprising because this is just a subset of the data, and you tend to get more higher correlation coefficients the more data points that you're including in this. And so the cabbage whites are declining. Is that what's pulling everything down? So the next thing we did is pull the cabbage whites out and look at everything else and see how it was doing. And that's the next slide. And you can see when you look at all other species, there is still a significant decline, negative 0.36 butterflies per hour per year. The p-value is 0.002, so that's a very significant p-value, and the R-squared is 0.42. Again, 42% of the variance in the data being explained by the model is not bad for an environmental study. So it's not the cabbage whites. The cabbage whites are declining, but they're not declining in a way that's pulling the numbers down. They're kind of going along with everybody else, is the take-home lesson here. Next slide, please. So that's what we've seen from butterflies. We also have the Illinois Ognate Survey here in Illinois, and that is also a readily accessible data set. Now, this is a much smaller data set than the Butterfly Network. For one thing, it was founded much later. The Butterfly Network was founded in 1987. The Ognate Survey wasn't founded until 2003. It was founded at the Nature Museum. It's basically a sister program to the Butterfly Monitoring Network. It uses the exact same data collection protocol, but when the person is out walking their route, they're not looking for butterflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. And even though the data set is much smaller than the IBMN, it's still usable. Not only has the Dragonfly Survey been around for a shorter period of time, each year we don't get as many Dragonfly surveys in. So in a given year, we're now typically getting over 1,000 butterfly surveys. We're getting about 450 Dragonfly surveys now. Smaller data set means that the analyses that we're going to be able to do are going to be a little bit less robust, but nonetheless, we can do the same type of analysis. Let's look at the next slide, please. So here is odonate abundance over time. The slope is minus 0.4 dragonflies per hour per year. That is the rate of decline in dragonfly observations. Again, this is between 2000 and 2018. The p-value is 0.01, which means that there is a 99% chance that these data are not correlated by random chance. And the R-squared is 0.36. So this is two more taxonomic groups that we are seeing evidence for a recent decline over time. Next slide, please. So in part, we have now answered the question. I don't see as many butterflies as I used to. Is this statement really true? The answer appears to be yes. The statement, in fact, is true. It is not just an artifact of human memory. We're not seeing as many butterflies. The overall rate of decline is negative 1.07 butterflies per hour per year. That means that from 2000 to 2018, there was a 31% decline from 44.08 to 30.54 butterflies per hour per year. And by the way, 2022 really was a particularly bad year for butterflies. So that 12 point whatever it was in fact unusually low. With dragonflies, it's actually even worse. There has been a 57% decline from 10.27 to 4.45 dragonflies per hour. And this all adds to a growing body of evidence regarding insect decline. Now, I wanted to add some stuff from more recently that may at least modify some of the depression that people may be feeling from these sorts of data. So I want to talk a little bit about a paper that it's not out. I am currently participating in the writing of this paper. Let's look at the next slide. The working title for this paper is Phenological Plasticity and Management Interventions Predict Trends in At-Risk Butterfly Populations. And one of the things to note in that title is that it includes the phrase management interventions. The Butterfly Monitoring Network was initially established to try to see what the effect of management on butterfly populations was. And we've been able to do all kinds of things with the data set that has resulted. And there have been about a dozen publications in the scientific literature using this data set now. But previously, none of the analyses have been able to take on the question for which the Butterfly Monitoring Network was founded. The lead authors are Dr. Cheryl Schultz, who is actually a professor at Washington State University, where Leon went. Colin Edwards, and Colin is one of Dr. Schultz's graduate students. And this particular study is not unlike the studies we were just looking at butterflies as a whole. This is looking at individual species, and it is looking specifically at individual species of conservation concern. And it's pulling from data sets all over the country. One of the things that we have learned about all of the studies that have been published using Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network data so far is that you can't just use Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. You've got to combine a whole bunch of data sets to get meaningful information out of it. And that's not a bad thing. This fact that this is looking at imperiled species from around the country gives me an opportunity, rare opportunity, to use a picture of butterfly, not from Illinois. This is the Palus varius blue from coastal California. This photo was taken in Long Beach, just south of Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So, as I say, this analysis is using multiple data sets, including the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. It's analyzing 114 populations of butterflies, including 31 at-risk species in 10 US states. The picture here is a falcate orange tip, and it is analyzing falcate orange tip in New Hampshire, where it's an endangered species. It's a good illustration because it's not imperiled in all parts of its range. Here in Illinois, it's limited to the southern tip of the state, and it's actually a pretty common butterfly. So some of the species that it's looking at are imperiled across their entire range, imperiled globally. Some of them are only imperiled in the area where data are being collected. So it's correlated population size with phenology, which is the time of year that different things happen. So the time of year that the swallows first arrive at San Juan Capistrano, that's phenology. The time of year that the maples first bud in Illinois, that's phenology. It's correlating population size with ecological traits. Voltinism is how many broods a butterfly has per year. So if there's just one generation per year, it's univoltine. If there are 2 generations per year, it's bivoltine, and so on. Most of the butterflies in Illinois that are specialists in, say, prairies or wetlands are univoltine. Are these univoltine species doing worse than bivoltine species? What are the effects of site management? And for the analysis, it doesn't parse out different kinds of management. So everything is lumped in. A lot of things that we're familiar with doing here, brush clearing, use of herbicides to get targeted invasive species, burning, other things, grazing, mowing. Some of those are employed to a greater degree in other parts of the country. All of them were lumped together, and it was simply comparing management and frequency of management versus no management. Position within the range of the butterfly. Is it at the southern edge of its range in the studied area? Is it in the core of its range? Is it at the northern edge of its range? If climate change is having something to do with this, you might expect species at the southern edge of their range to be faring particularly poorly. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the gory details of this. This is a really large, involved study, and the primary authors have done an enormous amount of work in it. Next slide, please. So here are the species that were analyzed from the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network data. Acadian hairstreak, which is a wetland species, Appalachian brown, which is a savanna species, Baltimore checker spot, illustrated here, which is a wetland species, black dash, broadwing, and Dion skipper, which are all wetland species. Doesn't skipper, which the analysis was at Ivanhoe Preserve in Indiana. That's a sand prairie species. Eye brown is a wetland species, and regal fritillary is a prairie species. And here are the sites, next slide, that these analyses were done on. So not all butterflies were analyzed at all sites, and many of the butterflies only had the analysis done at one site. So you can see these are in alphabetical order. There are a lot of sites that are going to be very familiar to people here. And so I am going to, next slide please, issue a strong caution here. And the caution is, this study is just in the latter stages of being written up at the moment. importantly, it has not yet been through peer review. Basically, the stage of writing it is, there were 17 authors on this paper. And the primary authors have sent copies of the manuscript to the 17 authors and are seeking input on the content of the paper from them. And there are some things I am planning, some comments I am making about the paper, but my feeling is that it's very strong. My feeling is also that the statistics are way above my pay grade in terms of being able to do statistics. So that I throw that in as an additional caveat. So this is very, very preliminary analysis at this point, and will remain so until it is subject to peer review. Next slide, please. So the conclusions, there is both good news and bad news in the conclusions. Let's look at the bad news first and get that out of the way. Next slide, please. Yes, populations in just these at-risk species are declining. Overall estimated growth rate equals, and the minus sign got pushed up to the line above, that's minus 0.085. Equivalent to an 8.1% decline per year. That is very large. That's also comparable to what we saw in the earlier analyses that we were doing. Some species were declining, some were increasing on this list, and that's important to remember because of the good news. Here's the good news. Next slide, please. The overwhelming signal in our data, this is a quote from the draft of the paper, the overwhelming signal in our data was that butterfly populations in sites with management interventions were increasing while those in places without those interventions were suffering. Our results imply that at a broad level, management works. Everybody who goes out on her work days, yay us. Next slide, please. Additionally, management interventions can be used to mitigate the population level effects of climate change. That's also really important. There are details of the analysis that support this statement. I'm just sort of giving you the conclusion here without any of the support for it. But one of the things that is an open question at the moment, there is some evidence pro and some against, is that in the 20th century, insect population declines were primarily a result of habitat degradation, something we've all been saying for years, something we've all been paying attention to for years. There are some studies that are starting to suggest that in the 21st century, insect population declines are a result of climate change. And therefore, the fact that management can mitigate the effects of climate change is a really, really important part of the conclusions, preliminary conclusions of this particular analysis. Next slide, please. So I would like to acknowledge, in particular, all of the volunteer data collectors of the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, the Illinois OatNate Survey, and all of the citizen science efforts across the country. If you are one of these people, if you're out collecting data, if you're wondering what happens to your data, this is part of what happens to your data. Yes, it is very, very useful. U.S. Forest Service and the Vanderpool Conservation Foundation have been important funders to this work. And with that, I will say thank you, and I think I have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Doug.
I'm sorry, we have a question here.
Go ahead.
I do. I'm curious, a lot of those dragonflies are impacted or wetland, it's more wetland specific. And of course, we've lost loads of wetlands and increasingly they are at risk. So that may further decrease those populations?
For the purposes of this talk, it's important to bear in mind that the dragonflies have had, for from the standpoint of analyses of this type of data, the least amount of attention paid to. So I am not aware of any published studies of this sort involving dragonflies. Of course, habitat loss is potentially a significant contributor to any population declines that might be happening with them. I've shown you some preliminary evidence that population declines are happening there, but again, with that part of the talk, it has not been through peer review.
And Pat on Zoom.
Hi. Let me just turn my.
I'm not coming through, Pat.
Yeah, Pat, it's best when you put the microphone right up to your mouth.
All right.
Thank you.
So following up, I think on the dragonfly question, I believe my understanding is that dragonflies are carnivores and they eat mosquitoes, which would likely increase with climate change. And so it's kind of confusing about why the population might be declining when I would think that would be, a good food source for them. And then I have a second question too, but I thought maybe you could comment on that.
Okay, regarding that question, it's really important to remember that there are a whole host of factors that are going to influence population size. Some of them are going to tend to increase population size, others are going to tend to decrease it. It can be very hard to predict a priori what the overall effect is going to be of everything that is going on in the environment today. When you factor changes in food levels, changes in temperature, degradation of habitat, all of those things. This is why we do this kind of work, is to see what the overall effect is, what's actually happening up there.
Well, thank you. So my other question then sort of relates to that. There's obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but there's a big push to restore milkweed in a lot of different places to support monarch butterflies. Is there anything that people who are doing that or trying to get legislation passed to do that, can we point to any study that says this actually is increasing the monarch population? And this is, I know there's regression analysis and things like that that can be done, or multivariate analysis. But is there a way that we can pinpoint milkweed habitat supporting monarch butterfly populations?
The literature there is very, very mixed. There are actually studies coming out that are saying that the milkweed limitation hypothesis is incorrect. There is no clear-cut alternate to that at the moment. The other thing that is starting to come up, again from multiple studies, is that the most consistent declines in monarch numbers are observed on the wintering grounds in Mexico. And there are now multiple studies suggesting that up here in the north, there actually has not been a statistically significant population decline. So it's a complex issue.
Okay, well,
Any more questions?
that's not exactly positive news for our efforts to try and, we have a monarch team in our group and at the Illinois level, and they're really advocating for, at least my understanding is advocating for repopulation of milkweed. But it seems like the science is mixed on that. Is there something else we should be advocating for then? Other than general, I guess, prairie restoration, but other than that, would there be anything else that we could do?
Well, yeah, the question of the monarch, again, is a complicated one because it's not altogether clear why the wintering population of monarchs in Mexico is declining and the picture is much more mixed up here on the breeding grounds in northern North America. That makes it very hard to say things like, what should we be advocating for? I think You know, that to my mind, that is one of the hopeful notes of the paper that I was talking about at the end of my remarks this evening, that general site management seems to be mitigating a lot of the problems that many species of butterflies are facing.
Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned, let's see, you mentioned that the climate change, you know, that some of the data is absolutely pointing to climate change. And you also compared butterflies to dragonflies. Uh, has there been any sort of like, I know there's analysis of variance, you know, like between those, you know, those species that can like show that there's a correlation there that points to climate change amongst all species of insects?
Okay. There's a reason that none of the studies that I've cited study all the insects at the same time. At least not if you're looking at species. Things like arthropod biomass take that on. But insects are so species diverse that you have to take a divide and conquer approach. And you know, I think I've shown some of the breadth of taxa that have been addressed in these studies. There have been more recently as well. But insects, when you consider something that represents over half the species diversity on the planet, insects, it's very difficult to make any blanket statements about all of them.
Okay, thanks.
So, Doug, the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network is mostly carried out in forest preserves and other protected lands like that, right? But it's natural habitat, at least one hopes, if we can keep it that way or turn it back into that. Is it your opinion that things like planting native flowers in your own garden would be helpful? My lawn is never going to be a natural habitat, despite the fact that natural lawn of America fertilizes it. There's no such thing as a natural lawn. Do you have any sense about the importance of what individual gardeners can do as compared with protecting more large-scale properties, public lands?
Yeah, my opinion is that I think both are important. I can't cite a lot of formal studies on that. I'm aware of a few. Anything that I'm aware of suggests that non-lawn is substantially better than lawn. Where you start running into a little trouble with, you know, your yard, your garden, and that sort of thing, is that most of the species, most of like the imperiled species that I had on that table, they're not going to be helped by your lawn. On the other hand, some of the other data that I've been showing show that it's not just the imperiled species that are declining. So doing things that are beneficial to all the other species that used to be thought of as simply common species that were everywhere is still important. And things that you do in your yard tend to be important for that. So it's not an either or thing by any stretch of the imagination. And they're both important in different ways. I think one of the other things about people's yards is that, you know, you've heard of non-point source pollution. The sources of pollution are difficult to control because they're scattered all over the place. People's yards is sort of like non-point source habitat restoration, where it's scattered all over the place, and any individual contribution is going to be modest, but the aggregate is what's really has the potential to help things.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, Doug. That was a great presentation. Sorry for all the little snags. Work on it. So next month we'll have another program. What is it on? Line 5?
Yeah, it's gonna be on this, gas pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac, the north end of Lake Michigan, Line
Right.
5. And very dangerous pipeline.
So check out the website for that coming up on the events calendar, and also the recording of this, which will be stopping very soon, probably in about 5 seconds.